Currently we have, a year and a half of the war in Ukraine. We lived through all the troubles. I meant both Ukraine and the European Union being very, very actively engaged. But what do you think we could have done differently and we still can make differently?
To be very honest, I think more can be done in terms of the transformations in the country. I think the civil society here is more and more active, is stronger today than before. But I think the reforms were quite courageous, but in fact there are still problems, namely the problem of corruption, which is a real problem. After I left the Commission, I'm now making conferences all over the world. I teach at the United States, also in Europe. And I speak very often with very important global investors. And the reason why they don't invest here more has to do with the doubts they have about the rule of law and corruption and not enough fight against corruption in Ukraine. So this issue has to be solved. At the same time, we have to be fair. It's very difficult to have this kind of efforts during a war when part of your country has been occupied. This is, of course, very, very tough. So, to conclude, I would ask the Ukrainian authorities to show even more determination in the reforms and the fight against corruption. But I would ask also the partners of Ukraine, including the European Union countries and others, to show patience and understand that Ukraine is in a very specific and challenging situation.
There are those in Russia who sometimes says that, the European Union maybe provoked Russia in some way. We usually debunk these talks and saying about, there is every statesman of every European politician always said, like, we don't want to make troubles with Russia, we really want to be engaged, we don't sell anything, it should be the will of Ukraine. But frankly, what would you answer on that, on this somehow an accusation, and what Europe could have done differently towards Russia, towards Ukraine?
Regarding that process of association agreement negotiations, I was there, so I know what happened. And I can tell you the accusations of the Russian propaganda are absolutely false. Absolutely false. They are lies. We did not want to provoke Russia. I was one of the leaders in that process. In fact, we were responding to a demand from Ukraine. Different governments of Ukraine, from President Yushchenko to President Yanukovych, they've asked to come closer to the European Union. Even sometimes they wanted to become members of the European Union. It was not, as the Russian propaganda says, a conspiracy of the West to grab Ukraine. No, it was the Ukrainian people with different governments that wanted to come closer to the European Union. And we said to the Ukraine at that time, to the Ukrainian authorities, we are not ready and you are not ready for membership. What we can do is an association agreement with a free trade area, a free trade component. And we have negotiated in good faith with Ukraine, and the Russians were informed. What happened was that Ukraine was able to initiate the agreement, but when Ukraine was going to sign the agreement, the Russian authorities put pressure on Ukraine. So the reality is that it was not the European Union that created an imbalance. It was Russia that broke this kind of balance. Let's be rational. What will be the interest of Europe in provoking Russia? We have no interest in provoking Russia. Russia is a relatively important partner for the European Union. But at the same time, we had there a country, Ukraine, that we should respect. And that country has unequivocally shown the interest to be closer to the European Union, European values, the European way of life, and so on. And we believe the country has the right to decide. That is the question. So, no conspiracy, there was no tentative to provoke the Russians. On the contrary, we wanted, and we believe it would have been possible, to have Ukraine in an association agreement and to have a constructive relation with Russia. So they broke that balance. That's the reality.
At the same time, in Ukraine also, among the civil society and the people who are really closely following the whole way of Ukraine towards the EU integration, would be they say that the European Union was sometimes very slow with the reaction. You know, when the European activists were asking to freeze the assets of the, Ukrainian politicians involved of any kind of corruption, that had taken place already after the people had been, there were casualties, and after the former President Yanukovych has gone, that, Europe was really too slow.
You have to understand one thing, and I was working as President of the Commission 10 years, so I can tell you how the European Union works. The European Union is not a country. It's not Russia or United States or China or Ukraine. We are a union today of 28 countries, and we have complex procedures. So sometimes it's true, it takes more time than what we would like to take. But at the end, I want to be fair, I think the European Union has played and is playing a very constructive role. Now, if you ask me, could we do more? Yes, we could do more. And as President of the Commission, I've asked the governments of Europe to do more. The current Commission is doing the same. Asking for more commitment of Europe to Ukraine, more commitment politically and also economically and financially. But at the same time, and this is very important, it's important that the Ukrainian people don't give up thinking, oh, that's the Europeans or the Americans who are going to solve our problems. No, it's the Ukrainians themselves. Support is important, but support is complementary to some efforts. So I think it is important that in the Ukrainian society people understand that it is up to the Ukrainians themselves now to show to the world, to Russia but also to the world, that this country is viable, that this country has the right to exist. Because I think the problem is that some people in the Kremlin believe that Ukraine should not be independent. That is the real problem. They have not really accepted intellectually, emotionally and politically the independence of a country called Ukraine. So you have to show that your country deserves to be independent and is able to decide its own future. And that is achieved through stability, democracy, and of course prosperity. And there the world, at least the free world, should be more active supporting Ukraine.
During the time you were running and taking the lead of the European Union for a decade, what was your experience with Russian leader, with Vladimir Putin, or with the Russian leadership while discussing EU agreement and Ukraine?
Look, President Putin was the leader outside Europe I've met the most. Because the European Union and Russia at that time, before the freezing of relations, we had 2 summits per year. So I went to many places in Russia, many places. I received him in Brussels. And even when he was Prime Minister, I kept going to Moscow and he kept coming to Brussels. So, and I met him in the margins of the G8. At that time they were in the G8, the G20 and so on. So I think I know relatively well Mr. Putin. And there was a negative evolution, I'm afraid, in the behavior of Mr. Putin. After his second election, the second time he became president again, he was toughening very much his positions, a more assertive Russia, unfortunately not for modernization of Russia, economic prosperity of Russia, but trying to assert the influence of Russia through military means. And I think this is not good. We had some conflicts with Russia, but once again, our strategy was not to create those conflicts. At the same time, we could not, just to please Russia, forget about Ukraine. That would not be fair.
Whether is this kind of a demands or discussion taking place from his side?
Look, I think we are too close to the events. Probably I'm going one day to write my memoirs. But I really believe that the president of Russia has not yet accepted the independence of Ukraine. He made many comments about Ukraine that I think no one should make about another country. Some kind of lack of respect for the country. Even before this conflict. Don't forget that we had before 2 gas crises that I had to negotiate with Putin how to solve this gas crisis. And so I had many conversations with Mr. Putin about Ukraine. And frankly, I did not like the tone in which he was speaking about Ukraine, with some contempt, some lack of respect. And this is not good, because we are realistic. We know very well that Russia is and will remain a very important power, and Russia is a neighbor of Ukraine and also of the European Union. We have common borders with Russia, for instance in Finland, but in other parts. So we have done our best to avoid a spiral of escalation of conflict, but it's important at the same time that we keep our dignity. I think the right position with Russia is to be firm without avoiding provocations that are useless. And we have to have the strategic patience to keep this position of firmness. If not, it's going to be bad for Ukraine, but also for Russia. Because let's not forget that Russia, it's a great country with a great history, is missing again the possibility of modernization, and also it's bad for the overall atmosphere in Europe. Let's compare the situation of Russia 20 years ago and now in terms of their standing in the world. Look and compare with China. China, because of the economic development they are much more influential today than Russia. But why didn't Russia has done not the same in economic terms? What is diversification of their economy? They sell even less now than they were selling in the Soviet Union times. That's the reality. So it is a tragedy for Russia. And it's a tragedy if the leadership in Russia believes that the best way to reassert their influence is by foreign intervention, by only a strong army. We know they have a strong army. That's not the point. What they should have now is a strong economy with pluralism in the economy and pluralism in the society.
What would you say to those who say not provoking Russia is a provocation for Russia because they take as much as they can, as in case of Crimea?
I think with Russia we should have a position that is firm, but not, let's say, provocative.
So how would you define that?
No, it's a question of, for instance, I think basically the position of Europe was the right one. When there was the annexation of Crimea, we took all diplomatic initiatives. We were united, the European Union, which is sometimes not easy, and we went to the United Nations together. But not only we made statements, we adopted sanctions, and that is not easy to have the agreement on the sanctions. So what could we have done differently? There were 2 possibilities. One, almost to do nothing, to pretend we did not see. Another one was to go to war. That was not realistic, and that will not help the situation. So I think basically we took a position of principle, and I'm very proud of that. Because, let's be frank about it, from an economic point of view for Europe, Russia could be more interested than Ukraine. Russia is the first supplier of gas to Europe. So if Europe was thinking only in economic terms, we would have a much more moderate reaction to Russia. No, we took a very difficult position on Russia, not a full confrontation. Let's be honest about this, and this I think our Ukrainian friends should understand. Nobody in Europe or in the United States wants a full-scale war with Russia, and that is not a solution. The solution for this conflict is not now to have wage a war against Russia. This is not our NATO going in war. That's not going to happen, and that will not be a solution. The solution is more complex. It is to keep our positions of principle, to keep the sanctions, to show Russia that this position they are taking has some costs, politically, diplomatically. They have been put out of the G8. Relative isolation in some areas. Economically, they are also suffering some pain. So it has some costs. But at the same time, the important thing now is the success of Ukraine. If success can be defined for stability and prosperity, let's put it very frankly. If Ukraine becomes a country like Finland, Finland has borders with Russia as well. That's a great victory. We did not more than that. Finland, a very prosperous country, developed, educated, rule of law, democracy, or even Poland. That's what we can. That will be the best response to Russia, is to have a Ukraine that is comparable to Finland or to Poland. And one day, why not, to be a member of the European Union. And in that moment, there will be no objection for Ukraine to join the European Union.
Do you remember the day and how you heard about the start of the occupation of Crimea? Was it a surprise for you?
I remember exactly the date, but I remember it was that was a shock. To be honest, after the events in Maidan, we were already expecting problems, not exactly the way they happened, not this kind of, because it was in fact a new type of war, this hybrid war, this kind of a very cynical way of making an undeclared war. So I could not say I was anticipating exactly what happened, but in the days before, we in the European Union, we were already anticipating big problems, like the ones we got afterwards. Yes, unfortunately.
But also there is always a question how it can harm that it can be predicted. The people would say, like there are hundreds of books how China occupied Taiwan, but why nobody could predict with all the means of communication, satellite, everything, intelligence?
My opinion is that contrary to what many analysts say, the Russians and Putin himself, they have not predicted all the steps. There is this commonplace that the Russians are good chess players, that they have anticipated everything. I don't think so. I think it was a series of events that was provoking reactions. And in fact, what was for Putin a big alarm was the revolt against Yanukovych. He does not want to have a Maidan in Moscow. And then, since there was this Crimea issue, and since they have this possibility, they were able, during some weeks and months, to prepare, of course, the full, because they have a very strong army and they have contingency planning. But I don't think it was everything originally planned like that, you see. So they are reacting. They are acting and reacting. Not everything is decided ex ante. And that's why I think, in strategic terms, of course, in this kind of conferences, people like to make scenarios and so on. Intellectually, they are very appealing. But there is one thing I know, not only intellectually, but politically. When you do not control some variables in an equation, look for those you control yourself. So instead of being all the time saying what will Mr. Putin do, what is going Russia to do, that frankly we don't know, let's do our homework. Let's do reforms in Ukraine. Let's work for Ukraine without corruption. And we Europeans, let's support more Ukraine. So let's change the variables that we can change and care about the others afterwards. Because if not, our strategy is going to be dependent on their strategy. And what we should is to have our own strategy. And afterwards, the others, they can react to it, you see. But I think it's a fundamental mistake. When everybody in this let's say, think tanks is always putting as the first element, what is Mr. Putin going to do? This is not the intelligent way. We should say, what are we going to do? What do we want to do? And then, afterwards, we can adapt the strategy to different circumstances.
During the time of Maidan, were you engaging Vladimir Putin into the conversation? To do something?
Not really in the moments of Maidan, but I was one of the very few leaders that kept the conversation with Mr. Putin. Myself and Angela Merkel, even in a more stronger way. But I always kept speaking with Mr. Putin. I call him Vladimir, he calls me José Manuel, because I think it's important to speak also when we do not agree. And it's when we don't agree that it's more important that we speak. And I think this is important, and people have to understand that. That's why I said earlier, in the positions regarding Ukraine, we should have position of principle and firm, but we should be balanced. We should avoid unrealistic positions. Some excessive positions, sometimes I understand them. They are very generous. They come from a big, let's say, deception, disillusion, but they are not very wise. Russia is a very important power. Very important power, and so it has to be managed carefully. I believe that we should be and we can be firm, but without provoking unnecessarily. I think there are two risks regarding Russia. One is to be too weak, to give up. As unfortunately, I've heard already today some Europeans saying here, oh, we need Russia for Iran, we need Russia for Syria, so let's make conciliations with Russia, and then Ukraine is not so important. This is a problem, that position. But there is also another problem. If we go, let's go now for a kind of a war against Russia. I mean, this is not helpful, frankly. So that's why I'm arguing in favor of a more balanced, firm but balanced position.
And there are today a lot of talks about Vladimir Putin going to the United Nations, speaking about how he would fight, in Syria to save the world from ISIS. Do you think there would be a lot of some trust and willingness to believe and see him as somebody who wants to save the world from ISIS and neglect what had been done before?
I mean, to be honest, Mr. Putin was always very concerned with some of these fundamentalist movements. Why? Because he also has that threat in Russia. There are many Muslims in Russia, and there are risks of terrorism there as well. So he has an interest, as Russian president, to avoid a spread of some of those movements. And there, I think he's sincere. Having said that, there is a deep disagreement. To fight those movements, he has made alliances with dictators like Assad in Syria that he believes gives stability to those countries. But in fact, we do not agree. It's apparent stability. Assad has probably killed much more people in Syria than ISIS. You see? So the Syrian case is an awful situation where, in fact, there is no solution, no good solution. All the solutions are bad. And so Mr. Putin is probably now going to use the possible influence he has in Syria to try to reinforce his international stature. And of course we have to listen what he has to propose. Having said this, it's important that the world, namely Europe, United States and others, do not forget Ukraine and don't put Ukraine as a second priority. And that's why this conference is important. And that's why I came here as well. Ukraine should remain in the top of the international agenda. Because what happened here, apart from the consequences for Ukraine, had consequences for all the European order and the world order. If the international community, when a big country, by the way, the biggest country in the world in geographical terms, makes the annexation of a small part of another country that is smaller, and if we do nothing, which world are we going to live? This is not acceptable. So it's important for Ukraine, but it's also important for the European and the global order. That's why we should keep the Ukrainian issue very high in the agenda. And yes, if there are possibilities of working with Putin in other areas, why not? We have to be realistic about that, but not diminishing the attention or the priority that the Ukrainian issue deserves.
Today Europe is following the story of the refugees coming, of the influx of the refugees coming to Europe. At the same time, there are a lot of people welcoming. There is a huge debate about how to integrate the people. At the same time, there are the countries with xenophobic views and those countries had been becoming the members of the European community when you were the president, and there was a particular development, though there is some rise of the populism, the rise of xenophobic moves, and also this talks about illiberal democracy by some of the new Eastern European leaders. What is your legacy and what you've done the way it shouldn't be done? What kind of would do different in order not to have it, and what is possible to do not to have it?
About the European Union, we have to be clear about the responsibilities of each one. I am responsible for what the European Commission has done. I'm not responsible for what some governments are doing. I know we are a union based on the free will. And so I cannot assume responsibility for statements of national leaders with whom I disagree profoundly. The European Commission, I'm proud to say, has always stood on the side of humanism, on the side of the respect of human dignity, for freedom, and we even launched infringement procedures against some governments in Europe that we thought were not respecting, for instance, the principle of non-discrimination, and so on. So broadly, the European Union as an institution should be proud, and I think we are doing a good job. Now, there are some governments in Europe, and there are some parties, and that's a concern, not only in Europe. Look at what's happening in the United States. The leader of the public opinion surveys of the Republican camp, he made xenophobic, racist remarks against the Mexicans. So there are today in some parts of the world, including the democracies, very dangerous xenophobic, nationalistic, populistic trends, and we have to be attentive to that. The European Commission, I'm sure, will continue to have this position, but we need leaders at national level that don't give up to these dark forces. Because in the history of Europe, we had these dark forces. It was here in Europe that we had the Shoah, the Holocaust, in one of the most civilized countries in the world, in Germany. It happened. So we have to be very firm, avoiding all kinds of ultranationalism, xenophobic and racism. But at the end, the decisions are to integrate more people. And I think we should do more, even more. So, by the way, an important thing to note, look, we speak about Syria. It's interesting that in spite of all the friendship between Russia and Syria, those Syrians want to escape, they don't go to Russia, they come to Europe. They come to freedom, and they come to countries where they want to live, not to Russia. Why? Because the model should be free societies and free economies.
And shortly the last, I know you have many hours talk with former Ukrainian President Yanukovych during the Maidan. Do you think in what cases you believed him and he was sincere?
Look, I'm going to surprise you, but I think he was not lying to me all the time. In fact, he said that he wanted to conclude the agreement, but he could not because of Russia pressure. I think Yanukovych, even if he was very close to Russia and also culturally is obvious very much, let's say, what sometimes we call homo sovieticos, but he was trying to get some margin of maneuver. He wanted the association agreement. He wanted very much the association agreement, but afterwards it was the Russians who did not let him conclude. Having said that, of course, at some moment I understood that it was useless to continue to speak with them, even if it took me a lot of time, because it was consecutive translation, so everything took a lot of time. But my sincere opinion is that he was not completely at the orders of Moscow when he was president of Ukraine, but unfortunately he had not sufficient margin to do what the Ukrainian people wanted, and that's what happened afterwards. The revolt, Maidan, he was in an impossible position.